Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and we're looking forward to having this conversation with Manish. So I think I'm going to start with a question. We're both going to talk a little bit about this, but I wanted to start by asking you, Manish, in your work, how do you meet the most pressing needs, like of the moment, the most urgent needs, while also addressing the root and structural causes, the systemic challenges that we face globally, and particularly with climate?
Great. Thank you, Celina. Great to be here with all of you today. My name is Manish Bapna. I'm the head of the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a fairly influential environmental organization. I was first sitting in this auditorium in 1987 as an incoming undergrad at MIT. Honestly, changed my major 7 times between when I started. I ended up as an electrical engineer, which is the biggest joke in my family because I'm the last person to touch a computer. But after a very meandering road, ended up at an environmental advocacy organization working on the climate crisis. It is, and it is such a fascinating problem to tackle. It is incredibly complex. And so one of the big challenges is how do you make sure what we're doing is actually moving the needle on something that is so large and complex as climate? And when you take a step back and think about this problem, what is the problem? The problem is really that our current economic system, major key economic systems, are incompatible with the climate, with the environment, with equity. And so we need to reimagine key economic systems. And the way I've been thinking a little bit about this is there's 3 major systems we need to reimagine. The energy system, how we produce, how we generate, how we use energy. The food and land use system, how we grow food, how it intersects with forests, how we use land, and kind of cities and buildings, how we design our cities, how we organize them, how we plan them, how we live in them, how we build them. And if we can get these 3 systems to be consistent with the climate, with the environment, with equity, we will have made huge progress. And this is about where do we need to be in 2050, how we think about not only reducing emissions, but how we think about resilience, how we think about economic development, how we think about equity. And as we think about what we do, are we convinced it takes us a step towards that future that we must see, that better future that we must realize? So maybe just to turn that question back to you.
I have never been on this stage, and I did not go to MIT, so I'm further away from the engineering than probably everybody in this room. I'm Celina. I'm a social entrepreneur as well. I'm from El Salvador. And yeah, I mean, I think for us, I work in Latin America, and we have 8% of the world's population, but 37% of its homicides. So the pressing need, one of the biggest pressing needs that we face is violence and the impacts of violence, trauma, stress, and how that can perpetuate violence and victimization. So in our work, and I think many other organizations as well, the way we're looking at the pressing needs and the balance of that and systems is that we are working deeply and over time in communities, with communities, to identify their priorities but always through public systems, through public schools, through public health facilities, and really drawing from that and accompanying that work with research, with partners like JPAL or the World Bank and local universities. So basically we go deep for long periods of time, evaluate, and then try to build the case and generate the evidence for strategies that can be brought to policymakers. So it's like really trying to make sure that policy is founded on and based on the priorities of people that actually live in communities and experience, the different challenges directly, whether they're social, economic, or environmental. So I'm going to go to our second question. I mean, these are all huge questions, obviously, but so can you share, Manish, some examples of collaborations in your work that have led to scale, that have led to deployment and adoption of solutions, and any lessons learned that you may have from, your professional experience?
Yeah, no, absolutely. For the past, when we think a little bit about solutions, we have to think about scale when we talk about the climate crisis. And a part of what I've seen really proliferate, expand in a very good way over the past 10, 15 years are a lot of collaborations involving startups in the private sector, governments and NGOs, where no single stakeholder or organization can solve a problem, but by coming together, they bring different perspectives, different skills in ways that can create the type of innovation we ultimately need to see. So just to give a couple of examples, from very boring things like how do you measure greenhouse gas emissions in a company? I worked quite actively with the private sector, with government stakeholders, NGOs, about how you design accounting tools to measure greenhouse gas emissions. We worked on something a little bit more kind of shiny and exciting, how to leverage remote sensing, cloud computing, ICT, to be able to monitor forest growth or cutting forests down in real time. How we think about resilience. We worked in India to help cities develop heat action plans. We know that extreme heat is a huge issue all around the world. How do you get cities in low resource settings to actually be able to respond quickly to those types of issues? And then you think about this country, how we worked together in a very, very different way to pass the climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. In all of these, and many, many more examples, the only reason these solutions succeeded at scale or went to scale is because of really interesting collaborations. And I think a couple of the lessons, is a real alignment on the overall objective? Are we clear about the distinct contributions different partners in a coalition or platform can actually bring to the table? And perhaps most importantly, share resources, don't fly your own flag. Everyone needs to feel they have a stake and find credit in the joint effort. Gandhi once said there are two types of people, those who do the work and those who take the credit. Try to be in the first group because there's a lot less competition there. It's a good thing to remember as you engage in these collaborations.
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think I'm going to echo a lot of what you said. I think that work across sectors, and one of the big challenges in working with government is obviously that there's a finite, depending on the context, but there's a finite number of years you have to work with government. It's complex. You may be aligned or not in the way the government, is governing, is ruling the country. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And I think what you said is getting aligned and remembering that we're responding to the priorities of the population and ultimately of the planet. So I think in our case, we just started. We're always looking to scale by working with government, like I said earlier, generating evidence. But we just launched an initiative in partnership and with support from the Audacious Project at TED, which is called Sanamente. And we're working to train over 100,000 frontline workers within government, so ministries of education, health, law enforcement, child protection. And we're training these people who are already serving on the front lines on trauma and also self-care, so they can better care for themselves and therefore integrate a trauma lens in the service they're providing to the communities they serve. So we're really strong believers in strengthening systems and remembering that people that make up those systems are also citizens, or regular people. So we typically are aligned in what we want at the end, even if we're not on the same side of a political spectrum or different in other ways. So it's like, how do you generate the demand, the institutional demand for something that evidence shows is necessary, and then also get out of the way, like you said, and you mentioned the Gandhi quote. I think sometimes that's hard for organizations. Like, if you've been successful, you probably won't be mentioned, right? And particularly in scaling with government. Like, if it's their idea, even though you brought it forward, then that's probably the best way to do it, because it'll outlive, It'll outlive the government terms or the timeline they're there. And I think, the climate crisis is so big, and you mentioned all these sectors, and it does require all of us to be so involved at the individual systems, institutional level. And, climate crisis is a major focus for NRDC. And there have been some big wins recently, like the passing of the climate bill last summer, which is a huge deal. And then I'd like to know, and I think we'd all like to know, what are your next big priorities that you want to, building on that success? What's next?
Yeah, no, one cannot overstate the significance of the climate bill that was passed last summer, at least for the United States, in terms of actually meeting our own climate goals. The climate goal that the President Biden put out a couple years ago need to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% by below 2005 levels by 2030. This climate bill gets the United States halfway there, but not all of the way there. So there's three things we need to see in the next 18 months. The first is we got to actually both defend and implement this climate bill. Right now, as we speak, in the debt ceiling negotiations that are taking place in Washington, there's an effort to try to gut key elements of the climate bill. And there has to be both a need to protect that, but also then a need to implement the climate bill, to make sure that the promises contained in that bill on the power sector, transportation, industry, agriculture, those things actually happen on the ground. The second thing that needs to happen is the government, the administration in Washington, the Biden administration, has powers to set standards and rules to actually help accelerate the transition. So if you think of the climate bill as primarily money and a set of carrots, there's some sticks that the administration can use to also accelerate the transition. So how it does that on power plants, on cars, on trucks, on appliances is absolutely critical. A couple weeks ago, they put forward rules on cars and trucks. In the next week, they're going to put forward rules on power plants. Those rules are proposed rules. They need to be finalized in a timely manner. And the third thing we need to see is states. Incredible opportunity for states to take more ambitious action. What we see oftentimes in the climate space is you have leadership states that are able to push the envelope of where we need to go, and that creates space for the federal government to follow. So what California does, what Massachusetts does, what New York does matters because it helps set the frontier of what actually is possible. Celina, this conference is about unlocking collective potential. How does that play out in the work that you're doing with youth mental health in Latin America?
Yeah, you were just talking about...
We'll assume that's for both of us, but...
Thank you. Yeah, we will assume it's for both of us. So I think you were talking about, taking action at the national level, at the state level. And I feel like collective action is about, if you're going to unlock collective action, the only way to do that is by unlocking individual action, right? So it's like unlocking individual human potential. So we work with young people who face a lot of adversity. And I think, one thing we've seen is that we need to create the conditions, and this obviously comes up a lot in conversations around immigration and other issues. But if we can create the conditions, the safe spaces, the conditions, the opportunities to learn for young people to thrive and get engaged, and even from a mental health standpoint, to be able to use that mental space and energy and feel like you can have an impact on your life and your environment, because it's hard to feel like you can impact the environment if you feel like you can't control your life on the way to school, right? Or that your life is at risk. So I think for us, it's like we've seen how young people then take action and become volunteers and get involved, but they need to feel safe and they need to have access to skill building and opportunity. So for us, I think we need to work on that. We need to work on individuals in order to be able to unlock the collective space. And we've seen that young people who go through these processes, then when they do become engaged, they really catalyze a lot more. They're better at movement building. They're better at leadership. We've hired 60 of our former students. So I'm hoping eventually they run, the organization, or they get involved in local politics or national politics. But I think it's working at those different levels, like you said, I think is key. So I think we need, and we're talking about like what levels we're working on, and I think we need to address climate with every tool we've got. I think now more than ever, the world is in absolute acute crisis in terms of climate. And I'm curious to know what the interplay is, or what you see as the interplay between policy work and tech innovation, especially at this conference where that's so relevant.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So most of the work that I do is on policy. I suspect most of the work that Solve and many of you do is on innovation. And the point is this is, as we all know, just so inextricably linked. So much of the solutions that we've seen come to scale have been because when you get that policy innovation kind of interlink working effectively, it allows us to go so much faster. Just a couple of quick thoughts on that. Policy can be good or it could be bad. So how we design policy to reflect this type of societal goods we want to see is incredibly important. I remember about 10 years ago when policy was being designed in ways that would support ethanol as a biofuel. That was a mistake. So there's a lot of examples of both good and bad. I think a couple of other kind of important things as we think about policy and innovation, a lot of the attention tends to get focused on the new shiny breakthrough technologies. And that's important, but I also want to keep kind of a focus on the kind of near-term incremental improvements we need in solar, in wind, in transmission. These small improvements of existing technologies are what we need in the next 10, 15 years to actually begin to move the needle. The other piece around looking at policy and innovation, we get a lot of thought on policy about how to support kind of R&D for mitigation in the developed world. And I just want people to think hard about also the interplay between policy and how we build solutions that improve resilience and that work in the developing world. We have all the R&D to help kind of major cash crops in this country. How much R&D is there to support heat or drought resistance for orphan crops in Africa? How we get those things right and the balance of effort right is absolutely critical. Speaking of resilience, we were chatting a few days ago about resilience and wanted to ask a few questions a little bit about the intersection of climate and mental health is just an important space to also be exploring.
Yeah, and I feel like we're going to close up soon, so I feel like this will be kind of a summary, at least for me, and then I'm going to ask you to do the same. But I think if you think about climate and the complexity and the climate crisis, there's also like what a colleague of mine calls a social climate crisis, right? So you can't, if you're unwell, you also cannot be an active participant or fully active in working on climate issues. So that intersection of climate and mental health and resilience, individual resilience in order to achieve climate resilience, I think is key. And I think is something that we can achieve, again, working at the community level, working at the systems and with institutions. So it is so urgent, but when your mind is focused on surviving, we were talking about this even earlier today, like feeding your family, health crisis, the climate crisis that we talk about and we're talking about now is experienced through a hurricane, an earthquake, your crops failing. So if you're thinking about those urgent things up front, it's hard to step back and think about it. And I think I'll just finish as kind of my last thought is, as we address all these complex issues, how do we remember to ask people what it is their priorities are? Like, how do we ask, not just institutionally so we can be aligned, like, if you ask someone what they want to achieve, right, their priorities, it's easier then to align with someone. And sometimes it's easy to forget that simple step, like just ask and keep asking. And I think that all these issues remind me, and when you're talking about the macro climate issues too, that we just need to keep asking in order to come together around something and stop battling around it, right? So I'm curious to know what your final words are as we go into the last minute or so of our session.
So just to maybe build a little bit on one of the things you said, as we think a little bit about where we need to see more innovation, I'm just so delighted a lot of focus on resilience is taking place, a lot of focus on the developing world is taking place, and as we do that, a couple of the things just to keep in mind that we see as necessary ingredients in the ecosystem to go to scale are the institutions in these contexts capable of scaling solutions? And is there adequate finance at the right terms to scale those solutions in many of these contexts? So looking at the institutional and financial dimensions and the role that you can play to help make sure that those are in place are incredibly important. The last thing I might say is I had an opportunity to speak about climate in one of the most intimidating places ever. It was my daughter's high school class. and you could imagine my daughter coming to me and saying, if there's one thing I beg you to do, please don't embarrass me. And so here I am talking to this 15-year-olds about climate, and I was struck by how deep they understood the content. And yet how to some extent they felt somewhat unclear about how to tackle it because it felt overwhelming. It felt so scary, so complex. And it just reminded me of something that my mother once told me a very long time ago. She told me that pessimists are right more often, but optimists win more often. And it is such a true quote about what we need right now with this incredibly existential crisis. So it is so great to be in a room with so much optimism and innovation. So thank you for having us today. Thank you.
Thank you.